SATANISM before and after the advent of Christ. My personal experience proved I was unable to piece together the many thousands of pieces of information and evidence I had gathered since 1918 concerning the World Revolutionary Movement, WRM. Until quite by accident I picked up a Bible in 1943 and started to glance through it because, I am now ashamed to confess, I was bored stiff lying on a hospital bed, with no other literature within reach which I hadn't already read. Ever since that day I have been convinced that what the vast majority of people call accidents or mere coincidence, are in reality, acts of God. I don't go so far as to say that the creator of this universe personally does things to us which will, if we heed what happens, seriously affect our lives, but I do believe that he wills such things to happen, and his angels, who are associated with this world of ours, put his divine will into effect. Be that as it may. As I glanced through the Bible I could not help but see that many statements seemed to have a direct connection with events of history and events which were happening in the 20th century. This aroused my interest. Further study convinced me that in the Bible was to be found the key which would unlock the mystery which surrounds what so many authors have referred to in the past as the secret power which rules from behind the scenes of all governments and causes them to adopt policies which ultimately lead to their own destruction. I therefore began to seek in the Bible the explanation of human events with which I had become familiar, but couldn't fathom the cause or reason for their happening. With this explanation I will proceed to explain Satanism as I understand it. Satanism is the manual of action which puts the Luciferian conspiracy into effect on this earth. The Old Testament, trimmed down to its greatest simplicity, is nothing more or less than the history of Satanism. It tells us how it has been directed since the fall of our first parents to the advent of Christ who incarnated to set us free from the bonds of Satanism with which the human race was being more securely tied generation after generation. The Holy Scriptures refer to Satan 67 times and to Christ only 63. But what concerns us most is the fact that the Holy Scriptures tell us and prove that Satan is prince of this world. John, XII:3:1, XIV:3:0, XVI:II. Because Satan is the adversary of God and his human creatures, he must, as prince of this world, be related to the WRM. The word world has admittedly different connotations. We can define a word in a favorable or neutral sense and use it to mean the earth where men dwell, or by metonymy, men in themselves. John 1, 9:10, 3, 17, 19, 27, etc. The word world can also be used, in the unfavorable sense, to mean the reign of evil on earth. Those who constitute the reign of evil are the synagogue of Satan. What they inspire and do, and have done, is diametrically opposed to the will of God. They set up a barrier between this world and Christ and his followers. To illustrate this, Christ is recorded by John as saying, "I am not of this world, I pray not for this world, me it hateth." And to his disciples, "You are not for the world hateth you," and so on. John 8:23, XVI 9, VII 7, XV 19, etc. Cf 1 John 3, 13, 14. Thus we can understand that, ever since the advent of Jesus Christ, Satanism has waged a perpetual war to prevent God's children on this earth from putting God's plan for the rule of the entire universe into operation upon this earth. By preventing us putting God's plan into effect, and by preventing us living the way of life as taught to us by Christ, and summarized in the words of the Lord's Prayer, Satanism prevents the masses from doing God's will on earth as it is done in heaven. This brings us to the interpretation of the Lord's Prayer. The preamble and middle require no explanation but the words, "And lead us not into temptation but deliver us from evil," most certainly do. How can we conceive that God would lead the members of the human race into temptation? He may, and undoubtedly does, permit us to be tempted by those who direct or serve Satanism. The scriptures tell us God will permit us to be tempted beyond our powers of resistance. Thus temptation enables us to prove whether we are for or against God. I have, as the vast majority of Christians have also done, repeated the Lord's Prayer daily since I could talk. But I never studied the words until I was on the flat of my back with a fractured spine in 1943. As the result of studying the words in their relation to Satanism, and the WRM, I reached the conclusion that the words would have had a better relationship had the interpretation into English been, "And let us not be led into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one, Satan." I was pleased to discover, long afterwards, that the Greek fathers of early Christianity, the ancient Roman fathers, and several liturgies were strongly in favor of the masculine rather than the neutral use of the words, amalo. The importance of this question is to be found in the fact that if we should be saying, "But deliver us from the evil one, Satan," it would automatically mean that Christ considered Satanism the author of all temptation and all the evil sin we can commit and, at the same time, be the director of all the evils we can be made to suffer as a means of weaning us away from faith in God. These thoughts caused me to do further research, and I found in the New Testament, and in the texts of the Desert Fathers, that Satan, and those of the synagogue of Satan, exercise a general direction or superintendence over all the evil, temporal, and spiritual, which is committed, or experienced, in this world. In support of this very interesting revelation as far as the WRM is concerned, we find that, "He that committeth sin is of the devil," 1 John 3. 8. And according to the Gospels and Epistles of St. John and St. Paul, it is Satan's empire Christ came to overthrow, and Satan and his agents, yours, are the root and cause of all evil, both spiritual and temporal, which ravages humanity. Much nearer our own time, St. Augustine supports this line of reasoning when he likens what is going on in the world to the city of sin, the devil, born as the result of the rejection of God by our first parents, as being in eternal opposition to the city of God. St. Thomas doesn't entirely agree with this definite and exact interpretation, so, as happens so often, it is just another case of everybody to their own liking. But, when we study the WRM in its relationship to Satanism as being practiced on this earth, it is important to remember that if Satan, or his agents in human form, can and do influence the decisions of individuals so they commit sin, it stands to reason that individual human beings so influenced can and do extend Satan's power for evil over the collective. Thus I found my reasoning to be based on a sound premise when I stated in Pawns in Logamy and the Red Fog over America that individuals who knowingly or unintentionally serve the cause of Satanism are responsible for stirring up dissensions which enable them to divide the masses into opposing camps on political, racial, social, economic, religious, and other issues, in order that they can then be armed and made to fight wars and revolutions, on an ever-increasing scale, so that, if this destructive policy is permitted to continue, it must lead to the final destruction of all forms of remaining governments and religions, and thus leave the field wide open for those who constitute the synagogue of Satan, to impose the Luciferian totalitarian dictatorship upon what remains of the human race. Brings us to another very important question. We might ask, as so many priests and ministers do, if the gates of hell shall not prevail against the Church of Christ, and if God is going to cast Satan and his followers down into hell following the final judgment, what is there to worry about? In my humble opinion, there is nothing to worry about, but a great deal remains to be done before that blessed event happens in order to save as many souls as possible from being deceived into defection from God. We can prove, as individuals, that we honestly and sincerely desire to love and serve God voluntarily for all eternity. We must work tirelessly to bring other souls to join us in that desire. In other words, we must become, as Christ admonished us, real soldiers of Jesus Christ and active enemies of the synagogue. If lies and deceits are the stock in trade used by the forces of evil, then we must shame the devil and confound his knavish tricks, by telling the truth, as far, as wide, and as quickly as possible. If individual assassinations, and wholesale murder, wars and revolutions are the means by which the satanic forces remove all obstacles from their path which delay them in usurping absolute world domination, then we must use every legal means to prevent wars and revolutions. Why does Satanism work to bring about a one-world government when powers of which they plan to usurp? Today the power held by the synagogue of Satan is neither general, nor complete, nor absolute. The forces of evil conspire to make their power absolute so they can enslave what remains of the human race absolutely, body, mind, and soul. Satanism believes in no half measures. When it comes to using lies and deceits, for the purpose of winning our immortal soul for Lucifer, they operate on the principle, winner takes all. The scriptures in Revelations tell us exactly what the final results will be. But the synagogue of Satan does not accept the scriptures as the inspired word of God. Therefore, those who serve the synagogue of Satan will continue to develop the Luciferian conspiracy in the belief that they will be able to establish a totalitarian dictatorship. They believe that if they can usurp world power, they can establish physical control over our bodies. They believe that this physical control will enable them to obtain mental control also, psychopolitics. They believe that mental control will enable them to erase all knowledge of God from the human mind and thus give Lucifer control of our souls for all eternity. Thus we arrive at the point which reveals what is meant by the phrase, used so often by communist writers, or I should say Satanist authors who write to promote communist and other subversive movements. The battle going on is for the minds of men. This proves that the ultimate objective of the WRM is not materialistic, as is generally supposed, but definitely spiritual, which so few authors and historians seem to have suspected. Reasoning along this line of thought brings us to the understanding of how the words, World Revolutionary Movement, are only the deceptive words Satanists use to conceal the existence of the continuing Luciferian conspiracy. They make the vast majority of people, ordained ministers as well as Christian laymen, believe that communism is the root of all existing evil, that it is atheistic and materialistic, and that control of temporal power is the ultimate objective. This half-truth is the biggest lie ever circulated by those who serve the father of lies. The truth is revealed in Ephesians 6:10-17, which tells us among other things, our wrestling struggle is not against flesh and blood but against principalities and the powers, against the world rules of this darkness, and against the spiritual forces of wickedness on high. The other half of the truth concealed from the general public is the fact that the synagogue of Satan control and use the destructive force of communism to further their secret plans to achieve world domination. The principalities, and the powers, are sections of the heavenly host from which Lucifer undoubtedly recruited many followers.